The morning begins in routine, and routine is what makes the next few seconds so terrible. Men arrive under refinery light and stack shadow. Boots strike metal grating. Steam drifts from lines already hot with product. Somewhere a valve wheel turns. Somewhere a pump trembles in its housing. With that constant industrial vibration, workers learn to feel through the soles of their feet. The air smells of oil, wet rust, sulfur, hot insulation, and smoke that never quite leaves a place like this. Nothing in the scene announces that death is only moments away. Then the refinery changes its nature. A blast tears through the plant with such force that the industrial order of the place disappears at once. Steel does not bend first. It jumps. And tanks and lines that are supposed to contain pressure and fuel instead release both in a single violent instant. Fire punches outward, windows collapse. Brick dust and insulation fill the air. The shockwave moves faster than understanding. Men nearest the source do not get a clean chance to react. Some are thrown. Some are buried under falling steel and masonry. Some vanish inside flame so sudden and so bright it seems less like fire than a wall. In technical terms, a refinery is a controlled system of heat, pressure, vapor, and storage. Crude oil and its fractions move through towers, pipes, furnaces, and tanks under conditions that must remain stable. If containment fails, the site does not simply catch fire. It becomes a chain of fuel, pressure, and ignition waiting to multiply destruction. What is built to refine energy can, and in an instant, release it with battlefield force. For the workers, this is not theory. This is the floor under their boots lurching. This is the handrail shaking under the palm. This is the roar so loud it seems to flatten the lungs, followed by the strange deadness in the ears that often comes after shock. Men who begin the shift, thinking about gauges, flow, and time cards, now search through smoke thick enough to blind them. They call out names and hear little except secondary explosions, falling metal, and the hiss of burning product spreading where it should never be allowed to run. Beyond the gates, families hear the detonation before they understand it. Inside the gates, the counting begins, and almost immediately the numbers refuse to stay small. This is the story of a preventable disaster, and of the industrial world that makes such disasters possible. The refinery does not rise by mistake. It rises because profit, fuel, and national demand converge in one place and turn open ground into a permanent fire hazard dressed as progress. By the time the plant takes shape, the industry it serves already feels indispensable. Homes need kerosene. Factories need lubricants. Railroads, ships, and later motor traffic demand ever larger volumes of refined petroleum. Crude oil by itself is only potential. It becomes wealth only after it is heated, separated, stored, and shipped in forms the market can use. That is why companies build these vast industrial complexes beside rail lines, waterways, pipelines, and working-class neighborhoods. Geography becomes economics. Economics becomes steel. Steel becomes a daily risk accepted in exchange for wages. A refinery solves a national problem and creates a local one. It helps feed a country's appetite for light, motion, heat, and industrial expansion. It also concentrates flammable liquids, volatile gases, high-pressure systems, and thousands of failure points inside one fenced landscape. To the public, it often appears as evidence of modern strength. Tall stacks, tank farms, flare lines, and pipe racks suggest order, technical mastery, and wealth on a scale ordinary labor can barely imagine. Investors see throughput. Executives see growth curves. Newspapers speak of development. But workers understand the place more intimately. They know the heat, radiating from process units before dawn. They know the metallic smell that clings to the air. They know the trembling catwalks, the hiss of steam, the pulse of pumps, the constant low thunder of a plant that never truly rests. That is the contradiction at the center of every refinery town. The same complex that pays the week's wages also teaches men to stand beside concentrated hazard and call it normal. A place built to refine fuel becomes a place that refines human tolerance for danger. Long hours, heavy output targets, and uninterrupted production create their own discipline. If the unit runs, the pay continues. If the unit stops, someone higher up begins asking costly questions. In that kind of system, caution is often treated as delay, and delay is treated as loss. For the men inside the gates, this is not abstract industrial history. It is the practical bargain of working life. Bread on the table in exchange for 12 hours among heat, vapor, pressure, and steel that can fail without mercy. If you value documentary history told from the workers' side of the fence, subscribe here, because this story does not begin with the explosion itself. It begins with the system built to make that explosion possible. And to understand why the destruction is so complete, it is necessary to step inside the machine that never sleeps. The refinery looks still from a distance. Up close, it never stops moving, never stops trembling, never stops carrying heat and pressure through steel that has no right to fail and every opportunity to do so. This is not one machine, but a chained system of vessels, towers, pumps, furnaces, condensers, pipelines, valves, and storage tanks spread across acres of metal and concrete. Crude oil enters dark, heavy, chemically mixed. It is heated until different parts of it separate by boiling range. The lighter vapors rise, the heavier fractions stay lower. Gasoline, kerosene, fuel oil, lubricants, and other products are drawn off through different stages, cooled, redirected, stored, and moved again. Every step depends on controlled temperature, stable pressure, clean flow, and intact containment. Every step also carries the possibility of rupture, ignition, or release. The physical scale matters. Towers climb above rooftops. Pipe racks run like elevated streets. Tanks hold enormous volumes of flammable product in quiet reserve. Furnaces operate at temperatures that turn feedstock into vapor. Pumps beat with a constant mechanical rhythm. Steam lines hiss. But relief systems stand ready for upset conditions because the entire site lives close to its danger limits, even on an ordinary shift. A refinery functions by keeping volatile material inside a disciplined path. If that path breaks, what looks like order becomes force. Continuous operation makes the system more profitable and more unforgiving. Shutting a unit down is expensive. Starting it again is difficult and often hazardous. So plants are built to run day and night, with workers inheriting not just the machinery, but its momentum. That momentum creates a deceptive calm. A line that hums the same way every day begins to sound safe. A tower venting lightly into the morning haze begins to look normal. A vibration underfoot becomes part of the environment, like weather or traffic. For the workers, the machine is not abstract engineering. It is the heat felt through gloves. It is the ladder rung warm before sunrise. It is the smell of hot metal, sulfur, oil mist, and wet insulation hanging low in the air. It is the roar of burners, the clatter of tools on grating, the dust caught on sweat, the habit of checking a gauge twice because a wrong reading here is not a paperwork problem, but a death sentence. Men learn the plant through repetition, and repetition can be cruel. It teaches skill. It also teaches acceptance. That is the refinery's most dangerous disguise. It presents itself as routine while carrying enough pressure, fuel, and ignition potential to devastate everyone inside its fence line. And the worst threats are not the visible ones, but the ones already moving through the air and steel where no worker can see them. The most dangerous part of the refinery is often the part that leaves no immediate mark on the eye. Men walk through heat, vibration, smoke, dust, and metal smell every day, yet the forces most likely to kill them are often colorless, odorless, buried inside steel, or hidden behind the appearance of normal operation. A refinery teaches workers to watch flame, pressure, and moving equipment, but hidden danger does not always announce itself with spectacle. Hydrocarbon vapor can drift low across concrete and settle into trenches, drains, or confined spaces, waiting for one spark. A cracked weld can hold under load for days, then fail under one more pressure cycle. Corrosion can eat through pipe wall thickness from the inside, leaving the outer surface deceptively intact. Relief valves can stick. Gauges can drift out of accuracy. A line can run hotter than it should. A vessel can carry internal stress no one on the ground can detect by sight alone. The plant remains noisy, hot, and active, and that constant noise becomes a kind of camouflage. Technically, this is what makes refining so treacherous. The system depends on containment. Flammable liquid must stay inside pipe, vessel, or tank. Vapor must stay where engineers intend it to stay. Pressure must remain within design limits. Once any one of those controls weakens, danger begins moving ahead of human awareness. The worker on shift may hear a change in tone from a pump, may feel an unusual shudder through steel grating, may smell something sharper in the air, but he is not given X-ray vision into a seam or real-time knowledge of metal fatigue, or the authority to shut down an entire unit simply because something feels wrong. That is where systemic negligence settles in. Warnings rarely arrive as one dramatic revelation. They come as leaks that are patched instead of eliminated, as maintenance deferred to the next turnaround, as inspection notes filed and forgotten, as complaints treated as inconvenience, as fatigue on 12-hour shifts where men expected to detect subtle abnormalities are themselves pushed toward exhaustion. A refinery can survive on borrowed safety margins for months, even years. That survival is then mistaken for proof that the risk is manageable. For the men working inside it, hidden danger becomes a grim routine. They keep walking catwalks warm with process heat. They keep checking valves through smoke and humming steel. They keep trusting instruments, supervisors, and a system that often asks them to stand beside forces no human body can survive once containment fails. And when a known hazard is left in place long enough, what begins as warning starts becoming design. If that truth stays with you, leave it in the comments, because once hidden warnings are ignored long enough, the next refinery fire no longer stands alone. It joins a pattern already written in steel, pressure, and preventable death. By the time this refinery becomes a graveyard, the industry already knows what fire inside a petroleum plant can do. The warning is not hidden in theory. It is written in earlier blast sites, in burned tank farms, in collapsed pipe racks, in coroners' lists, and in the stunned silence that follows every preventable disaster declared isolated after the smoke clears. Other refineries and storage facilities have already erupted under familiar conditions. A tank overheats. A vapor cloud escapes containment. A corroded line releases product into the wrong space at the wrong moment. A relief system cannot control the surge. A shutdown comes too late or does not come at all. The details vary from site to site, but the pattern remains brutally consistent. First, there is the ordinary shift noise: pumps beating, burners roaring, steel warm under the hand, air heavy with oil mist and sulfur. Then comes a leak, a pressure rise, a weak seam, an ignition source. Then the same violent sequence repeats itself: a flash, a concussion, fragmented steel, fire spreading along lines and drainage paths built for production, not survival. Technically, these earlier refinery fires and explosions are not random misfortunes. They expose recurring weaknesses in industrial design and industrial judgment. Poor spacing between tanks allows one unit to endanger the next. Inadequate venting turns pressure into rupture. Failing instrumentation leaves workers reacting to old information. Deferred maintenance keeps corroded equipment in service until metal fatigue becomes a death sentence. Investigators often identify these hazards after each disaster with painful clarity. The industry learns enough to describe the danger. It simply does not learn enough to stop reproducing it. That is the part that matters. The warnings are not absent. They are documented, circulated, discussed, and then diluted. One company treats its fire as a local failure. Another treats its blast as unusual circumstances. A third points to operator error, damaged equipment, or unforeseeable conditions. The language changes. The underlying truth does not. These plants continue to run with vast fuel loads, dense layouts, aging infrastructure, and men expected to work close to systems that have already shown how catastrophically they can fail. For workers, this pattern creates a special kind of dread. They do not need every engineering report to understand what repeated fire means. They know by smell, by vibration, by stories traded between shifts and across towns. They know another plant has burned somewhere else, and they know management speaks of it as someone else's problem. That is how a preventable disaster becomes industry habit. One fire at a time, each treated as separate, each carrying the same lesson nobody wants to pay to absorb. And when those lessons are ignored long enough, the danger stops belonging only to the men on shift. It settles over the neighborhoods built just beyond the fence. The refinery does not stand apart from human life. It stands beside it, above it, and sometimes over it, its towers and tanks looming over homes, porches, school routes, laundry lines, and streets where children grow up learning that the distant roar is simply part of the day. This is how refinery towns are built. The plant arrives first as wages, not as threat. It offers steady work in places where steady work is scarce. Men take 12-hour shifts because rent is due, because children need shoes, because the company payroll reaches farther than any warning ever does. Around the fence line, neighborhoods settle into the shadow of steel. Houses sit close enough to hear valves release, or close enough to feel low vibration through window glass, close enough to smell sulfur, oil, smoke, and hot metal when the wind turns. At night, the flare light stains the clouds orange. By morning, the same families rise, cook breakfast, send men through the gate, and try to live as though this arrangement is ordinary. Technically, this is what makes industrial exposure so cruel. A refinery is not only dangerous at the point of operation, it carries risk outward through blast pressure, fire spread, toxic smoke, airborne debris, and the simple fact of proximity. If tanks rupture or process units fail, damage does not stop neatly at the property line. Heat radiates beyond walls. Windows shatter streets away. Smoke drifts over roofs and schoolyards. A plant built for constant throughput can place an entire community inside consequences it did not choose. But dependence changes how danger is judged. The same families living within reach of the refinery also depend on it for groceries, mortgages, church donations, hardware sales, barber chairs filled on payday, and local shops that survive because the shifts keep coming. That dependence does not erase fear. It disciplines it. Sirens become familiar. Odors become background. Small fires become stories told at supper instead of reasons to leave. Workers carry this contradiction every day. They know the plant can kill them. They also know staying home can ruin them more slowly. So the town learns to coexist with a force it cannot control. Wives listen for whistles and distant booms. Children recognize the smell of trouble before they understand the chemistry behind it. Men walk toward the gates before dawn with lunch pails and fatigue already in their shoulders, trusting that routine will hold for one more shift. Then one morning routine breaks, and the violence inside the fence moves faster than any town can prepare for. It takes longer to draw breath than it does for the refinery to begin killing men. One failure, one release, one ignition, and the entire industrial landscape changes character in less than a second. The moment begins with something small enough to be missed by anyone not standing near it. A seam gives way, a line ruptures, a vessel or tank loses containment under pressure it is supposed to hold. Hot product escapes into open air, or flammable vapor expands into spaces where only routine is expected. Then comes the ignition, not gradually, not with warning generous enough to save the men nearest the source. The flash front races through fuel-rich air with a speed the human nervous system cannot match. The blast wave follows. Steel jumps off its anchors. Brick and concrete split apart. Windows burst inward and outward at once. Dust, insulation, shattered glass, and fragments of metal fill the air so densely that the plant seems to disintegrate into its own materials. Technically, the sequence is brutal and simple. A refinery works by keeping hydrocarbons confined inside equipment designed for heat, flow, and pressure. Once confinement fails, the site no longer behaves like a controlled process plant. It behaves like stored energy suddenly released. If the escaping material forms a vapor cloud, ignition creates explosive overpressure. If superheated liquid is involved, the expansion is even more violent. Tanks, lines, and process units become sources of force instead of containers. The machinery of production becomes the physics of destruction. For the workers inside the kill zone, this is not a diagram. It is the floor striking upward through their boots. It is a handrail wrenching under the palm. It is heat arriving so fast and so hard it feels solid. It is the roar of rupture followed by a strange sudden silence inside the ears, the body's stunned response to shock. Men turn toward the first report and are overtaken by the second. Some are thrown against steelwork. Some are buried under collapsing structures. Some are caught in open areas where fire spreads low and fast, feeding on product released from broken lines. Escape routes disappear in smoke, debris, and flame before they can be used. Stairways twist, platforms collapse, catwalks become traps. There is no meaningful chance for heroics here, only fragments of instinct. A man ducks. Another calls a name he cannot hear answered. Another tries to move through black smoke carrying the smell of burning oil, scorched paint, hot metal, and pulverized masonry. Men who begin the shift with tools in hand are now navigating a landscape that has become mechanically hostile to human survival. This is the true violence of a preventable refinery disaster. It does not merely injure. It overwhelms the body before judgment, training, or experience can intervene. The system fails first. The workers pay first. And once the first explosion tears the site open, the destruction does not stay where it begins. The first explosion does not end the disaster. It opens it. Once fire escapes containment inside a refinery, the entire site begins offering it new fuel, new pathways, and new victims. What starts at one point of failure now moves through the plant with terrifying logic. Burning product pours from broken lines and shattered vessels, running along trenches, drains, and concrete channels never meant to become rivers of flame. Pipe racks carry heat from one unit to the next. Storage tanks, standing only minutes earlier in ordinary silence, are now exposed to blast damage, radiant heat, and flying fragments of steel. Secondary explosions begin arriving with irregular timing, each one sharp enough to shake already damaged structures and keep men guessing where the next blow will come from. The air is full of black smoke, masonry dust, sparks, and the metallic smell of ruptured equipment. Fire climbs upward, then spreads low, then erupts sideways, because refinery destruction does not move neatly. It multiplies. Technically, this is why major petroleum fires are so difficult to stop once they break free. A refinery concentrates fuel, heat, pressure, and interconnected equipment in one dense industrial landscape. If one unit fails catastrophically, adjacent tanks, transfer lines, and process areas become exposed in seconds. Firefighters can try to cool surrounding equipment, cut off feed lines, and keep flames from reaching additional storage, but radiant heat often becomes too intense for close approach. Water alone is rarely enough. Foam takes time, coordination, and access. Access itself may already be gone. Roads are blocked by debris. Steel is collapsing. Valves are unreachable. Every minute the fire burns unchecked, the site becomes harder to re-enter and more dangerous to defend. For workers and emergency crews, this is the moment when the refinery stops being a workplace and becomes a map of expanding entrapment. Men who survive the initial blast now move through smoke so dense it turns daylight into a dim orange blur. Boots slide on oil, water, and shattered glass. Breathing becomes labor. Orientation breaks down. The roar of open flame merges with the scream of escaping steam, the crash of falling steel, and then, at intervals, the sudden silence that follows another detonation before the echoes arrive. Structures beyond the epicenter begin failing, not because they caused the disaster, but because no large refinery fire respects boundaries once containment is lost. And as the fire pushes outward beyond the original unit, the number of the dead and the missing begins to rise faster than anyone at the gate is willing to say aloud. The fire leaves destruction in plain view, but the full human toll emerges more slowly. First, there is smoke, heat, and confusion. Then there is counting. Then there is the far worse realization that some men are not late, not sheltered, not yet found. They are gone. In the hours after the refinery tears itself apart, the list of the dead does not arrive all at once. It grows. Injured men are carried out, burned, bleeding, half blind with smoke and dust. Others stagger beyond the gates under their own power, clothes scorched, hands shaking, ears still deadened by the force of the blast. But for many families, there is no immediate answer at all. There is only waiting outside fences, at hospitals, at union halls, at church steps, in kitchens where breakfast plates have gone cold. Names are checked, then checked again. A worker accounted for in one rumor disappears in the next. A man said to be safe is found missing by noon. Another is identified only by where he was last seen standing when the unit failed. Technically, disasters of this scale make recovery cruelly difficult. Extreme heat can consume remains beyond recognition. Collapsed steel, broken masonry, and burning product can bury bodies under unstable wreckage for hours or days. Fires must be controlled before full search can begin, and every delay deepens the suffering of the living. The official death toll becomes a number. Oh, but the number hides the violence required to produce it. For the community, this is where industrial language fails completely. The dead are not losses. They are men with routines, pay envelopes, work boots by the door, children waiting for them, wives listening for footsteps that never come. The missing occupy an especially brutal space between hope and grief. Families cannot mourn properly because the system that exposed these men to catastrophe cannot even return them quickly to those who loved them. Economic devastation follows close behind. A funeral is one burden. Lost wages, hospital costs, damaged homes, and the sudden collapse of household stability are another. The refinery's owners can calculate production loss. The town counts something else. Empty chairs, unopened lunch pails, beds untouched at night, and a silence that spreads house by house. Then the investigators arrive, and the fight over what these deaths are allowed to mean begins almost immediately. The dead are barely buried before the system begins protecting its own legitimacy. Not with open cruelty, with procedure, with statements, with technical language carefully narrowed until a preventable disaster starts sounding like a broken part instead of a broken order. Investigators enter the ruins once the heat drops enough to allow approach. They move through twisted steel, wet ash, shattered concrete, and the lingering smell of burned oil, hot metal, smoke, and chemical residue that clings to everything after a refinery fire. They measure fragments. They inspect seams, valves, gauges, supports, and pressure boundaries. They reconstruct timelines from damaged instruments and surviving testimony. This work matters. A refinery failure does have an immediate cause. A vessel ruptures. A line loses containment. A pressure surge exceeds design limits. Ignition finds vapor where vapor should never be. But the danger begins when the inquiry stops there. Technically, the nearest cause is only the final link in a longer chain. Steel does not fail in a moral vacuum. Corrosion develops over time. Maintenance is deferred by decision. Alarms are ignored because they sound too often. Shutdowns are delayed because production targets weigh more heavily than caution. Hazardous layouts remain in place because redesign costs money. Staffing levels shrink while responsibilities expand. By the time investigators find the failed component, the larger system has already had years to prepare that component to fail, and yet the official response often narrows instead of widening. The report speaks of equipment malfunction, unforeseeable conditions, operator error, procedural lapse. Each phrase has enough truth to be useful and enough limitation to be protective. Corporate statements express regret, promise review, praise emergency response, and speak of lessons learned. What they rarely say plainly is that workers were required to labor inside a system already known to carry lethal weaknesses. Responsibility is reduced to what can be repaired quickly and explained cleanly. For the men who survive, and for the families of those who do not, this narrowing feels like a second injury. They know what the plant was like before the explosion. They know which lines leaked, which shutdowns were resisted, which repairs were postponed, which dangers had become routine enough to stop surprising anyone on shift. But workers do not write the final language of accountability. Executives, lawyers, insurers, and investigators do. That is how the system saves itself, It acknowledges damage while protecting the structure that produced it. It replaces metal, restores throughput, settles claims, and calls the matter understood. But the real question is not how one unit failed on one day. The real question is why an industry keeps arranging work so that the next failure is always waiting. The refinery keeps running because stopping costs money. That is the cold center of the story, and it explains more than any single failed valve, ruptured seam, or ruined tank ever can. In a plant built around continuous production, every shutdown carries financial punishment. Units taken offline stop generating saleable product. Repairs delay shipments. Maintenance consumes labor hours, replacement parts, inspection time, and management attention. Redesigning hazardous layouts means admitting the layout is hazardous. Replacing aging equipment before it fails means spending money before disaster forces the expense. Expanding staffing, slowing startup, widening safety margins, improving vent systems, relocating exposed workers, and honoring longer maintenance windows all cut into the smooth arithmetic of output. On paper, these are costs. On the ground, they are the difference between a hard day's work and mass death. Technically, refineries operate within narrow tolerances. Heat, pressure, flow, and containment must remain stable across interconnected systems. And the more densely the plant is built, the more vulnerable each part becomes to failure elsewhere. The older the equipment, the more critical inspection and replacement become. The longer maintenance is deferred, the more likely corrosion, fatigue, vibration damage, sticking valves, and instrument drift begin combining into one lethal chain. None of this is mysterious. The engineering is understood. The danger is documented. What fails is not knowledge. What fails is the willingness to sacrifice production for protection. Workers live inside that imbalance every shift. They hear the pump that sounds wrong. They smell the line that should not be leaking. They feel the unusual shudder in catwalk steel under their boots. They know when a repair is temporary and when a warning has started repeating itself. But knowing is not the same as having power. A worker can report, a foreman can worry, a maintenance crew can recommend. Yet the authority to stop the unit often belongs to people farther from the heat, farther from the vibration, farther from the smoke and metal smell, and far less likely to be standing in the kill zone when containment fails. That is why this pattern keeps returning. A man needing wages is asked to trust a system that measures delay in dollars and death in compensation. A town dependent on payroll is taught to fear closure more than chronic exposure. A company learns that outrage fades faster than capital loss. The culture that grows from this is quiet, disciplined, and lethal. It accepts preventable danger as part of ordinary operations until ordinary operations become a funeral procession. If you have a view on where responsibility truly sits in a plant like this, leave it in the comments, because the final lesson of refinery catastrophe is not hidden in the blast itself. It is hidden in the decision to keep the plant running one shift longer. After the fire, the refinery is rebuilt in steel, paperwork, and official promises. The dead are not rebuilt at all. That is the first truth their absence leaves behind. In the aftermath of a preventable disaster, something always changes. Investigators recommend stronger safeguards. Inspectors call for tighter procedures. Engineers revise spacing, containment, venting, shutdown logic, firefighting access, or inspection intervals. New rules appear on paper because old practices have already demonstrated what they are willing to cost in human life. And the plant may reopen with reinforced systems, altered layouts, better alarms, stricter checks, or more formal emergency planning. Publicly, this is called progress. In narrow technical terms, some of it is. Metal is replaced, valves are upgraded, distances are recalculated, fire protection improves, but technical correction is never the whole story because the deepest hazard is not only mechanical, it is moral. The refinery remains what it was before, a place where profit depends on men standing close to heat, pressure, vibration, smoke, dust, metal smell, and forces that can turn ordinary labor into mass death in seconds. That is why legacy matters more than repair. A plant can modernize its equipment while preserving the same discipline that made the original disaster possible. Warning signs can still be treated as inconvenience. Undeferred maintenance can still be rationalized. Workers can still be expected to trust systems they do not control. The surface changes, the underlying bargain often does not. For families and communities, memory becomes its own form of testimony. The dead remain present in small, stubborn ways. A photograph kept in a hallway, a name spoken at church, a lunch pail never thrown away, a story repeated at supper by people who understand that industrial history is not made only by tycoons, executives, and engineers. It is made by men whose bodies absorb the consequences when safety margins are traded for output. That is the final lesson this disaster leaves behind. Greed rarely announces itself with dramatic words. More often, it appears as delay, denial, accepted risk, postponed repair, one more shift, one more run, or one more day of asking workers to trust what management refuses to stop. The memorial is not only in the names of the dead, it is in the warning they leave to the living. If this kind of grave industrial history matters to you, stay with the channel, because these stories are never only about the past. They are about what industry still asks human beings to endure.